Hello everybody, good day. So today we're gonna learn on chapter 3, which is big data framework. All right, so big data frame, you need to know on big data framework for you to be able to make the big data analytics, right? So you have learned on big data characteristics, the 4 V's. You also have learned on the data types, the types of data of big data. So moving on into chapter 3, you need to also know what is the big data frameworks. All right, so when you look at this diagram, it consists of 8 layers of big data framework. Sometimes people term it as big data framework, sometimes people term it as big data components. It's just the same. For you to allow big data to be processed, you need to consider all these 8 layers, so then the processing can take place. All right, so if you look at this one, you have interfaces and feeds from and to internet, you have redundant physical infrastructure, you have security infrastructure, operational database, organizing databases and tools, analytical data warehouses and data marts, analytics, report and visualization, and the last layer is big data application. We will look at these layers one by one layer as we move on into next slides. Okay, but bear in mind, why you need to learn on this big data framework, because you need to prepare all these 8 layers for the big data able to be processed. Okay, so the first one is redundant physical infrastructure. So look at the term redundant physical infrastructure. Physical infrastructure. So when you say about physical infrastructure, it means that all the physical hardwares, equipments, network, okay, those are the physical ones, right? So a physical infrastructures consists of encompasses of hardwares, networks, equipment, and so on. And looking at this, you have to be aware of big data principles. There are 5 big data principles that you have to consider when you want to, let's say you have a company that you want to do the process of big data, right? So the first one is you have to understand, or you have to know of the performance of big data in terms of latency. Latency is, it means that how much lagging that your system can allow for the data to be able to be extracted into your system. Okay, so how responsive you want your system to be, measured end to end based on a single transaction or query request. It means that we need to pull data from the sources. You already know in chapter 2 that the sources of big data may come from social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, right? So you need to make sure, because big data involve high volume of data, so you have to make sure your system can pull the data as quick as possible, or if you allow some lagging, so how responsive that your system is allowed to, right? So the next one is availability, right? So you have to make sure your data is at 100% uptime of service, or what, right? Because big data is about real-time data. Okay, people need their real-time data for them to be able to make decision. For example, weather forecast. Okay, people always look at if you travel, you always depend on the weather forecast before you can go to travel and so on. Okay, so how prepared are you to make your data available at all time? Right, so scalability, we know that big data involves in high volume of data. All right, so scalability means how can your system to be, how extensive your system can be expanded, right? Considering that data will keep on coming with high volume of data. Okay, how big your infrastructure that you need, okay, the space, the storage, okay, power, and so on. Okay, sorry. The next one is flexibility. How quickly you can add more resources, because you know that when you look at this scalability, okay, let's say today you got 5 exabyte of data. Next week you may have like 100 exabyte of data. So you may need to make your infrastructure elastic in such a way that you may need to add resources. Instead of having the existing 6 servers, for example, coming next week, you may need to add on one more server to become 7 servers. This is the example of how flexible your system is in adding resources. All right. The last one is cost. You know that when data is very priceless, and you have to prepare the framework for the big data. So of course, it involves high cost for you to be able to to provide this infrastructure, right? So you also can decide to use cloud service if you cannot be able to purchase lots of hardwares. You can use cloud service that is provided by third-party organization, okay, to use their infrastructure, okay, be it hardware, servers, networks, platform, okay, and so on. And if you decided to use cloud-based services, whose responsibility to provide the design of the infra? Okay, so basically, if you decided to use the cloud service, you are not responsible to provide the design of the infra. Okay, it is the responsibility of the organization who provided the service. Okay, all right. Okay, so physical redundant network. One of them is physical redundant network. It means that when you say redundant physical network, basically it is about making a backup. Okay, backup of the hardwares, backup of the servers, backup of the networks, equipments, and so on, in case because you need the data real time. You cannot be able to have a system that suddenly have a down hardware and so on. So how can you pull the data? So you have to be on standby. Okay, so in terms of physical redundant network, you can also redundant the network. Okay, it must redundant and have enough capacity to accommodate anticipated high volume and high speed of inbound or outbound network traffic. Okay, you have to have infrastructure. You have to have an infrastructure that is elastic. It means that, like I mentioned just now, maybe you need to expand your storage, or maybe you need to expand your infrastructure, or maybe you can scale down infrastructure when there are not that much of data. Okay, you also have to have a way to manage your hardware, right? Storage, you have to be prepared of how big the capacity of the storage that you can provide, because you know data is huge, big data is huge, high volume of data, and you also have to provide services to people, okay, to organization. So storage and servers must have sufficient speed and capacity for you to avoid bottleneck, right? Because you know that if you have a bottleneck, it will be slow. The data that you pull in will be a bit slow, and you will be left behind as compared to your rival competitors. All right. You also have to be prepared on the infrastructure operation management. Data center managers need to anticipate or predict and prevent failures to ensure the integrity of data. You do not want, when you process the data, then suddenly your infrastructure down, you cannot be able to pull all of the data. Okay. Alright, that is about the physical redundant infrastructure. Remember of the term redundant infrastructure, so it means that you have to make backups for the physical infrastructure, be it hardware, or maybe network, maybe equipments, and so on. So the next layer is on security infrastructure. Big data involves data that you gather from, most of them is from social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or you can also retrieve the data from satellite and so on. You have learned that in chapter 2. So you have to make sure you have the security elements installed in your system to make sure nobody can hack your data, because you know that these days data is very priceless. Okay, so in terms of data access, you have to make sure only certain people allowed to retrieve, to use, or to see certain data. For example, um, salary. You cannot allow everybody to see salary people's salary. So you can only allow salary data to be accessed by HR people, right? So that is in terms of the data. You also have to think of the application access, right? Which party, which organization can able to use that application as compared to other, right? So APIs offer protection from unauthorized usage. You also have to think of data encryption, right? This is one of the common element in security infrastructure. Threat detection, because you know that big data involved getting the data from mobile devices and social network, right? So when you involve this medium, you know that there will always threat that try to spoof the data and so on. Okay, so you have to, when you want to make a big data processing, you have to consider the security infrastructure as well. Okay, so the next layer is interfaces and feeds to and from applications and internet. This is, you can say, this is the gate, okay, from your system, between your system and the application, or from your system and the sources that you're going to pull the data. All right, so interface services is for bidirectional access to all components of the stack. It means that you want to, let's say you want to pull the data from Twitter. So your system have to have a medium or mediator to be able or to connect your system to that social media. Okay, so application programming interface API is used to provide access to and from software implementation, right? You also may need to use natural language processing NLP technique that deal with all types of data. Okay, because NLP is used when you need to analyze the data. All right. So the next layer is on operational database. You have considered physical infrastructure. You have considered security infrastructure. You have considered the medium or the interfaces to feed to and for data. Now you have to think of the operational databases, right? So you have to think of where are you going to store your data. Of course, you need a database, okay, where we call that operational database. So it's very important to know what types of data that you can manipulate by that database. So this 1, 2, 3, 4 is actually the basic elements of what database should have. Atomicity, a transaction is all or nothing. Okay, it means that you know that you are dealing with lots of data, right? So sometimes you apply the distributed computing. Distributed computing means you separate or you break the transaction, the big transaction, into smaller workstation, okay, or virtual machines. So you have to make sure the data that you receive is all, so that you can have a comprehensive analysis. You also have to consider the database to be consistency of the data, right? So that what you look at the data is just the same as what other people see the data, right? Isolation, we talk about when you say big data, because the data is huge. Sometimes you need to apply the distributed computing or apply the virtualization. Okay, distributed computing means you break up the processing, okay, to several stations. Okay, so in each of the workstation or transaction, you have to make sure they will not interfere with each other. You do your job, okay? Workstation do their own job, workstation 2 do the job, workstation 3 do their job, and later they will combine the result. Okay, and lastly is the durability. It means that you have to make sure the data is flexible, sustainable to be used. Okay. Alright, this is the example of the characteristics on SQL and NoSQL database. SQL is for structured data. NoSQL database is for unstructured and semi-structured data. Alright, next layer is about organizing data, services, and tools. So you have stored the data in your operational database. Now it's time for you to organize your data. Alright. This process means that when you have lots of data, it does not mean that you need all of the data. Okay, it means that you only pick up, okay, the data that you need depending on what you want to process. Let's say you pull the data from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, but your focus is you just want to focus on food, for example. So you have to do some data cleansing, you have to do some data messaging, you have to filter the data to make sure you just take the data about food, right? You also may need to validate the data because not all data from social media are accurate or good data. Okay, so usually they use MapReduce technique. We have one chapter on MapReduce technique. Okay, and you have to know how to organize the data services lah. Okay, so technology that they use in this layer is distributed file system, serialization services, coordination services, extract, transform, and load tools, and workflow services. Distributed file system means that you may need to distribute the transaction into several workstations. Serialization services, it means that you may need to think of the data storage and multi-language remote procedure calls for you to make sure the services are good, can be executed. Coordination service, you need to make sure the transactions are coordinated nicely. Extract, transform, and load ETL tools, it means this is the process where you cleanse the data, you filter the data, you reformat the data, because let's say you pull the data from Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Those three may have a different format of data, but because you want to process the data, you want to analyze the data, you may need to reformat into a standard format. Okay, and the workflow services lah. Right, so the next layer is analytical data warehouse. So you have the previous layer, you have cleansed your data, you have managed the data, you have know the groups of data. Next is you need to store those data into data warehouse. This is the analogy. Imagine the IKEA warehouse. Okay, so they put all of the furniture into one warehouse, furniture warehouse in IKEA. But if you notice, they arrange their furnitures into sections, into categories, into lines, into rows, into columns, right? So that people easy to go to that particular section and so on. So it same goes to this data warehouse. You put all your data into data warehouse, but let's say you need to segregate or you need to group the data into their similarity, maybe sales data, maybe about HR data, maybe about students data, maybe about customer data. You can create another smaller version of data warehouse. They call that data mart. So you may have like 5 data marts, one data mart on sales, one data mart on customer, one data mart on services, one data mart on salary, financial data, and so on. Okay, and that is where then it's easy for you to process the data. Okay. Okay, so the next one is, the last slide is on the big data analytics. This is where you do the processing, okay, the analytics, right? So there are existing analytic tools and techniques that will be helpful in making sense of big data, because for all you know, you have to make sure the data or the information that you produce based on the processed big data have to make sense to people, can help people. So there are a few classes of tools that you can use in this area. So one of them is reporting and dashboard. This is, I mean, when you got people don't want to see the facts and figures, they want to see the meaningful information. So you may need to put those information, those data that you got in terms of reporting, so that people are easy to understand your information. So it provides user-friendly representation of information from various sources. Let's say you got the sources from Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You have to arrange them in such a way that people understand your information, what you are trying to say to people. Okay, so the next one, you may also want to use visualization. Visualize comes from the word visual. Okay, so it means that you can represent your data in terms of, you can put them in graph, can put them in chart, okay, can put them in infographics, animation, and so on, so that people can understand better the information that you got, okay, rather than they read the data, I mean the facts and figures and so on. So another class is actually on advanced analytics, right? It means that you can do some predictive analytics to predict something, to predict what gonna happen in future, so that organization can be prepared or can produce better. All right, so I guess that's all for this chapter. Thank you.